We're going to begin our afternoon session with a keynote address from Dr. Ronald Clark titled Prescient Insights or Perilous Path, The Challenges of Big Data in a World Where Everything Gets Hacked. Dr. Ronald Clark is a senior advisor to Adelphi Capital and the CEO of Spartan Strategy and Risk Management. As Deputy Undersecretary for National Protection, he oversaw the Office of Cyber and Infrastructure Analysis, the Office of Infrastructure Protection, the Federal Protective Service, and the Office of Biometrics and Identity Management. Under Presidents Obama and Bush, Dr. Clark served on the National Security Council staff and in the Executive Office of the President, respectively. Dr. Clark is a retired Marine Corps Infantry and Force Reconnaissance officer who led units in combat overseas and served as a senior advisor to the Multinational Forces Iraq Commander and to the Commander of U.S. Central Command. He is the recipient of numerous awards, including the Defense Superior Service Medal, the Bronze Star Medal, and 2 National Security Council Outstanding Service Awards. Dr. Clark received a BA from the University of Rochester and a Master's in Education and a PhD from the University of Virginia. Please welcome Dr. Ronald Clark.
Well, Ava, thank you for that really kind introduction. It's great to be here. Great to see so many old friends as well. Before I came up here tonight, an old colleague reminded me of kind of a words of wisdom. Be careful about going down the world of thanking everyone in the room, because the people you thank will forget. The people you forget to thank will never forget. So I'll avoid that perilous path, but great thanks to all for putting this together and pulling together such a great group. Now, I know time is always of concern. I promise my remarks but won't go over 2 hours. Kidding, just kidding. I'll keep us on schedule or get us back on schedule, I promise. It's school night and our time is precious together. So I thought what I would try to do is sort of integrate and complement what's already been provided today and give some sort of alternative and different perspectives on this. So prescient insights or perilous paths. In our brief period of time, I'll try to answer both of those questions or give you a perspective on both of those questions from really 3 perspectives. One is that as a military officer, spent unfortunately most of his adult life overseas, then from a long 5 years at the National Security Council under 2 presidents, and then finally at my time at the Department of Homeland Security. And then I'm going to turn over to one of the nation's truly unsung heroes, but leading national cybersecurity experts, Nate, who's up here with me, and he's going to show you what a hack actually looks like. He comes from Black Point Cyber. It's an entity. It's a little Ferrari race shop in Maryland, founded by former National Security Agency folks and Johns Hopkins Applied Physics members. So they're sort of a pretty high-end shop, and Nate will show you what a hack actually looks like. It will sort of illuminate. I imagine most of you are hacktivists, or have done hacking. So Nate will kind of walk you through kind of a module so you can actually see what it looks like. So, big data. I think we've already sort of addressed sort of the definitional challenges associated with it. What's big? If you look back in 1997, there's an obscure report from NASA that attempts to that's where you first start seeing this language, and really it's tied to more their challenges of sort of the ability to sort of process information is really where it kind of starts, and then it takes on a life of its own. I tend to think of big data as 2 things. It's sort of like fire. It can cook your food or burn your house down, depending upon how you use it. You can have lots of data, but if you don't have the pipes and the analytical capacity to make sense of it, then it's largely sort of a foolish path to go down. You can have big data, the pipes, and the analytical capacity to make sense of it, but if you don't have the action elements necessary to prosecute it in a law enforcement or a military context, then again, it's sort of an exercise in frustration. So think about Southern Command. There's actually a mismatch between the information we know about how cartels move narcotics via various routes into the United States, and there's a mismatch in those international spaces of the amount of actual assets that we apply against that body of information. And the mismatch is that Southern Command is dramatically under-resourced. But again, so there again is that sort of exercise in frustration. The other thing I would just illuminate on, I'm seeing Rick Fuentes, kind of the, many of you know him, he needs no introduction, but someone who spent his entire adult life protecting the citizens of New Jersey. When you think about when Rick first started, big data is really not that new. think a bunch of pins in a map, right? And those pins, you start seeing a concentration of shootings in various areas. Well, what have you just done, right? You're now correlating events to geography, time, and space. And in many ways, when big data is applied in a law enforcement or military context, essentially what you're trying to do, one potential application, not all, but one potential application is you're trying to accelerate this sense of wisdom that only is gained after 30 years, right? So Rick can look at the world and intuitively know how things will work out, right? So if you talk to an old cop, and what will he tell you about protests, right? Pray for it to be about 39 degrees and rainy, right? I see some law enforcement guys laughing about there, right? I mean, it's almost a guarantee that hell no, we won't go. I'm cold, I'm hungry, I'm wet, I'm out of here, right? Now, a hot summer night, okay, well now that's a little different, right? But not too hot. Again, you don't want to disperse the crowd too early, but so there's an attempt to aggregate massive amounts of data to sort of replace that wisdom and experience that comes, right? This massive accumulation of experience that results in the ability to make intuitive decisions. So that's, I don't think, necessarily completely new. If you think of any large-scale military operation, again, there's this dimension of sort of big data, integrated, made sense out of it through different methods, but as opposed to sort of massive computational tools. Now, of course, what is new, the volume of it, right? I mean, just the sheer enormous volume of what we've created, right? The variety of it, and how fast it comes, and how fast it changes, and also how we have become increasingly dependent upon it, right? In all walks of our life. So, the inspirational message, it can be awesome or it can be awful. But I'll walk you through kind of two case studies. One's the Battle of Sadr City in 2008, and the second is sort of a more recent sort of law enforcement example here in the homeland. But I thought what I would do is I would also sort of show you two things. So what's changed? And it's 100 things, but I have about 42 more minutes left, and we have to do a hack demo. So we're just going to focus on sensors and storage, from evolution to a full revolution. And I'm just going to pick one sensor that will be particularly relevant as we jump to the Sadr City example. Non-traditional aviation technology. Everyone in the rooms know there's been an extraordinary proliferation of it. But here's my first exposure to non-traditional aviation technology. This is the USS Austin. That ship is off the coast of Bosnia. The aircraft that you see, maybe not particularly well, here, that's an RQ-2 Pioneer, one of the earliest UAVs. In order for it to launch off a short runway, you had to actually put rocket packs on it. Does anyone know how you actually recovered the RQ-2 Pioneer? Yeah, so you put up a net on the back of the ship and you crashed the net into it. And there was an additional Connex box, a kit box, when you broke the wings and broke the sensors on it that you would then repair it. And basically every time it landed, you then had to fix it. And you can imagine the sensor package was equally sophisticated on it. So that's the 90s, that's Bosnia, that's ops in Africa. Jump forward to today, and now you see this enormous proliferation from, the miniaturization of it, from, US SOCOM Puma, all the way up to the Global Hawk, and of course, some iconic platforms that have now become part of sort of a broader lexicon. And it's not just fixed wing, it's also rotary wing assets as well. And each one of those presents unique opportunities, but also unique challenges. These are sort of nation-state level platforms, China, Russia, North Korea, asymmetrical threats. So this is actually, so who do you think took this photo with a drone? Yeah, ISIS. Exactly right. Then there's also the criminal context. So this was actually captured in a prison yard. The intention of this drone was to deliver a care package to a prisoner. That right there is a 12-inch hacksaw blade. There's 5.3 ounces of marijuana. There's 0.8 ounces of methamphetamine. There's a gram of heroin, 2 packets of cigarettes, and a package of gum. Because, of course he wanted gum as well as the methamphetamine, the heroin, the marijuana, and his cigarettes. But it's sort of a new set of challenges, right? And where do we see drones operating right now, from drug cartels as well as those that facilitate human trafficking? Yeah, on our southern border, right? We've started seeing transnational drug organizations, transnational criminal organizations increasingly using drones for the obvious purpose. The other challenge too is, miniaturization, rapidly moving forward miniaturization that's available to a broader thing. So that's kind of the non-traditional aviation technology spectrum and how fast it's advanced. This will tie to Sadr City, I promise you. One last thing. So when I went to amphibious reconnaissance school, we were actually taught on how to do reconnaissance sketches. Yes, that's literally me in camouflage with cami paint laying on my stomach and like drawing a sketch of a building. And then I would take my 35 millimeter camera, I would hopefully get some great shots, but then you had to get me all the way back, extract me, and then I could download the intelligence feed on the other side. So this is the conduct of hydrographic reconnaissance. So off the coast in Liberia in the 90s, if you were doing a hydrographic reconnaissance, that's it in World War II. That's it in the 90s, not particularly different. So it's focused on scuba. You basically are trying to check, and in part, if you were trying to facilitate the evacuation of the embassy in Liberia, just a purely hypothetical scenario, as many of you know, we're on like a 7-year cycle. Basically, every 7 years, we're trying to evacuate the embassy in Liberia. But you have to check sort of the hydrographic reconnaissance to see what assets, what sea-based assets can go in to actually pull folks out. But what you do is you would send a force reconnaissance unit in, and they would actually physically go down and confirm depth of water, depth of tide, all of that, right? So now, how did they do it? In a high-threat environment, you'll send a drone in, and the drone will do it in about a fraction of the time without the potential loss of life or compromise. Okay, so how does all that matter? So, and then storage, right? I mean, and I think we've already covered that in depth, right? I mean, it's an overwhelming the capacity to store, right? But that has lots of downsides to it, right? So just take Rutgers University, right? And I don't know this, but is Rutgers retaining past students? Is every student that graduates purged from the database? Most of the time, the answer is, Nate, right? Just buy a bigger database, right? Buy more space and just keep everyone in there, right? Because it's just easier, right? And there's enormous downside to that, enormous risk. So, okay, so how does that matter to the Battle of Sadr City in 2008, which I think is it's a really compelling example of how big data was used to prosecute a very large operation. So this map may look familiar to some. So anyone know what this line is? So that's a 2-mile cement wall with T-walls. T-walls are about 2 feet thick, about 15 feet high. The challenge with Sadr City in 2008 was from Sadr City here, you could reach the green zone where the embassy was. You could reach where Prime Minister Maliki's main headquarters was. And as a growing Shiite militia became increasingly unstable, rocket attacks were becoming prohibitive and shutting down operations in the green zone. So the decision was made that a buffer zone had to be created in Sadr City. The challenge was to create that buffer zone, you had to send in an Army Brigade combat team, special operations forces, and they would both prosecute internal operations, but they'd also have to create this wall. And they have to do this wall under pressure. So on a bad day, that brigade combat team could get about 8 T-walls. And a T-wall is about as big as each one of those. So on a bad day, a brigade combat team of 700 soldiers would get about 8 of them in because of the enormous pressure, right? And the Shia militias knew that once that wall was created, that was the buffer zone necessary to give them the stand. They would no longer have the capacity to reach the green zone or Prime Minister Maliki, which would reduce some of their negotiation, their bargaining chip. So the challenge is too, though, right? 2.5 million people, right? So a really, really dense urban environment. It's an ancient city, so any of you have ever operated in those environments, like the ability to have any level of predictive qualities and looking at an urban environment and reading a building from the outside in, and when you have sort of layers of cities, 2,000 years on top of it, you have really no idea once you penetrate that structure, you know, turn left, turn right, up, down, it's all going to end up being pretty twisted and pretty upside down, different than what you think. So, but again, the geometry, Sadr City, Green Zone, Baghdad University, Rashid Military Airport, and the Grand Mosque, all within range of rockets. So the decision is made, endorsed by Prime Minister Maliki, that we're going to build a wall, and we're going to make them pay for it. So the problem, and this is going to be a joint operation with Iraqis, with coalition forces as well. So there's this challenge of we have to also isolate the objective, right? So now it can't be a conventional operation, right? There's too many innocent civilians in this for this to be a conventional operation. You know, a very complex clearing operation is not a viable option, right? So this has to be both a high-end counterterrorism operation, but also very classic counterinsurgency. But in order to do that, right, you have to isolate the counterinsurgency, and that's what you see around here. All these checkpoints are designed to isolate and deny reinforcements of the counterinsurgency, and then the wall. So you see two things here, right? So really low tech, right? I'm talking about a cement wall. But in order for that cement wall to be successful, all of this architecture had to be created above it. So at the tactical level, you have Ravens and Shadows, ISR platforms, providing very near-term tactical. The role of the Shadow and the Raven was to afford the initial detection of movement of potential insurgent elements moving to known rocket locations. That was then integrated with core theater level assets. You start seeing old platforms like U2, you start seeing satellite assets, Global Hawks, and then of course there's action arms, both rotary wing, fixed wing, but also Predators. Aerostat also provides, so blimps, you also see them on the border today. All that was designed to create both this enormous amount of sensors, right? An enormous number of sensors are collecting an unprecedented amount of information, but that doesn't really matter unless you have the pipes and the analytical capacity to do anything with it. So when I was at the National Security Council, invariably at some point every month, there would be some foreign partner or ally wanting to buy whatever the latest unmanned aerial vehicle was, right? And oftentimes it was the Predator, that was the iconic platform at the time. The problem was it's not just as simple as selling the end platform, right? The platform is going to provide you with an enormous amount of information, but you have to be able to do something with it, right? You have to be able to fuse all of this together. And the fusion isn't just as simple as that, right? So, and I'll go through this quickly, but so those sensors, all that non-traditional aviation technology from the tactical level all the way up to national strategic assets, all then has to be fused and integrated with human intelligence, the imagery intelligence, geospatial intelligence, measurement signal intelligence, technical intelligence, and then of course a massive volume of open source intel that's coming in as well. So the Battle of Sadr City starts off with probably in the first 14 days, about 120 improvised explosive device events every day, every single day. Gun battles usually took about 23 hours of the day. There's usually a 1 hour lull somewhere you found where there's not some kinetic activity somewhere. For every T-wall that was laid, there was not a single one that wasn't a gunfight associated with it. So the question was, how do you operate in this environment with a level of precision? So by using and integrating the Shadows, the Ravens, the Predators, these air teams, and very precise munitions, as well as both using Iraqi Special Operations Forces, our own Special Operations Forces, taking all this enormous data, getting it down to where it could actually be predictive intelligence. So by the end of the Battle of Sadr City, May 2008, ceasefire is signed. You're literally watching an insurgent element move along Route Blue, and if they stop at Objective 7, they stop, trunk opens, rockets are put in the trunk. That from Objective 7, there's only 2 possible locations they'll go from there based on the patterns that you have, right? Based on running the data against it, there's only 2 locations for it. So you then shift kinetic assets to have overwatch of those 2 locations and then reduce that threat. Reduce that threat in a really, really specific way. Again, it's counterinsurgency, right? So the people are the prize. You can't use large kind of imprecise systems in this process. But again, it's this enormous fusion of information, and you should think about, well, how much is it? Well, Preds were persistent. There's probably at any given time 20 or 30 unmanned aerial vehicle assets, full motion video, day, night, pulling information in. But now it's a question of what do you do with all that stuff, right? And how do you fuse it with human intelligence? How do you fuse it with assets on the ground, communicating when there's going to be a large gathering of potential insurgent fighters? And you would tend to think that the mismatch here is that, of course, this is the classic doctrine of where the U.S. sort of enters into a fight, and we're sort of overwhelming the adversary with a much larger sort of ground force presence. In this case, the fight starts off without a 700-person brigade combat team against 4,000 against the 4,000-man insurgency. So there's a 4-to-1 ratio in favor of the adversary in this scenario, but those 700 troops are enabled by an enormous, massive architecture that is actually allowing them. It's a great case of where it's not just once that you can see predictive intelligence occurring at a tactical level, but it's every 24-hour cycle. You can see that all of this information was actually driving not only actionable intelligence, but predictive intelligence that led to very decisive results. And you could also, over time, you could watch early on the fights when the first 10 T-walls were laid, the adversary was operating in 30 to 40 person elements, almost like platoon size elements, those who are familiar with sort of Army or Marine Corps doctrine. And then by the end of the conflict, they're operating in 2-man elements at best. Again, because they recognize that that was no longer a viable platform, no longer a pathway to go for them. But I would illuminate as well that absolutely, unequivocally, the ability to use precision, to really eliminate collateral damage, the ability to also reduce casualties both with Iraqi forces and U.S. forces was completely a product of an enormous fusion of intelligence, enormous amount of information and data. But all that wouldn't have mattered if you didn't really understand that you've got to build this wall to deny the adversary the standoff and sanctuary that they need to achieve the kinetic effects against the green zone and the Baghdad, right? So it's no tech cement. combined with a very expensive and exquisite architecture above it. All right, we're doing okay on time. Okay, so that's kind of a military example, and there's enough time to where we can talk about it comfortably. That was 10 years ago, but here's kind of a slightly more recent example right here in the United States. One of the fundamental challenges, of course, is this question of, you think about it from the lens of like defense, right? The challenge in the United States against a various number of foreign asymmetrical actors that wish to do all of us harm is it's hard to defend, it's hard to be strong everywhere, right? You can't defend everything all the time, right? So at Department of Homeland Security, we launched a series of intelligence-driven operations working with state, local, and federal partners designed to disrupt, dismantle, and defeat adversaries that were penetrating the United States, trying to achieve kinetic disruptive effects in the homeland. But it was all intelligence-driven, and fundamentally you had to accept vulnerability in one place while surging assets into another to achieve those disruptive effects. But again, it was all driven by that intelligence picture, all driven by a massive accumulation of information by big data to try to produce an actionable element. Okay, so I've just talked to you about how we've won the battle of Sadr City and how we're keeping America safe, all a product of big data. Now I'll give you kind of the alternative, right? The flip side of the coin. The good, the bad, the ugly, and the worst. One, there's no replacement for human judgment. Even when you think about it from a financial marketplace, right? And you think about sort of, now at times it seems like a long forgotten financial crisis. If you go into Lehman Brothers, go into any of the big banks, and actually, what was in part driving their sort of analytical assessment of where they were in the market, yeah, they were running big data, they were running algorithms. The problem is the algorithms were wrong. So every day the CEO got a report that only reinforced his pre-existing position in the market was a viable path to go forward. But again, that's the challenge, right? When the data's wrong, you put bad data in, it corrupts the data set, and it just accumulates over time, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. There are some, and I've actually even had conversations with colleagues that talk about the integration of big data in military operations, where literally, I would literally have an iPad, I would look down, and Hal would tell me whether it's time to attack or not attack, right? Hal would tell me that based on current environmentals, based on big intel picture, now is not the time to advance forward. And that may be a potential insight, may have some potential value, but again, you don't want to replace human judgment in it. And a little bit of this, that's the challenge is allegory in the cave. Anyone? Maybe the students, probably more. I see some people smiling. Students are probably the ones that remember more, right? Plato's Republic, allegory in the cave. What's the challenge, right? Those sitting in front, seeing the shadows, believe that's reality, and they seek to find information that is reality. I mean, think about even how when you read one news article on one section, what's the system designed to do, right? You shop for X, and what does it do? Well, it keeps pushing all that information to it. And the challenge with a world where I read an article and that perspective is then reinforced by people sending me more articles, keeps pushing me down a certain direction, right? So sometimes if you're having conversations with someone somewhere else, there are potentially, unless they're consciously trying to move out and get a much broader sense of a picture, that shadows in the cave thing is occurring, right? They're just constantly being fed the same information. And fundamentally, right, allegory in caves, it takes the good man and a great effort to actually find the good, to find the light, to find what is actually true and what's not true. Not as easy as it might appear. So the good, the bad, and the worst. One is, of course, obviously massive data breaches that before this day and age would have never been possible at any other time before that. If you look at Keith Alexander, one of our longest-serving national security directors of the National Security Agency, Keith has basically defined this last period as the greatest wealth transfer in history, and it's all designed by the ability for us to store massive amounts of data, massive amounts of your data, and then for adversaries to get in there, and Nate will come up here soon and show you what that actually looks like, and for them to penetrate that data set, exploit it, corrupt it, destroy it, pick the one that they want to do. Oftentimes it's exploitation, depending upon what the actor is, whether it's a thief, a spy, a thug. Each one of them has hacktivists. They all have sort of a different agenda, but fundamentally, absent that data set, that would not have been possible in years past. And the commonality you see in all these breaches, and a lot of times we get lost in phishing and malware and worms and all this exquisite stuff, but fundamentally, an adversary has to get inside your network and then laterally spread. So think about it as this network of tables, right? So I may land on a table that's of very little value, but now I'm inside the network. When I'm actually on the keyboard, though, a hacker doesn't actually know where he is, not initially. He needs to start laterally spreading. He needs to move to this box with a whole bunch of people. And Ava has admin privileges. Well, guess what that means? Ava now has access to every one of these other tables, right? And Ava now finds another person who has admin privileges to another set of potential data sets. And that's how you end up with OPM, where you don't lose one national security clearance, you lose the entire national security clearances of your entire national security professionals in the United States, all at once. And again, that wouldn't have been possible absent the infusion of big data. So let me read you something, and I want you guys to guess when this was written and who wrote it. So the risks posed to aggregated data are numerous and derived from both external and internal threats, such as natural disasters, failures of internal controls, sabotage, and attacks. The following scenario describes the problem. A database containing 100,000 records for current and past students at a large university in the Northeast was attacked by unknown parties on the internet. The compromised data contained admissions, health, academic transcript, disciplinary action, residency, housing, student employment, and emergency contact information. The school's response was to warn current students and alumni of the risk posed to them by their information being possibly copied and stolen. They were encouraged to be vigilant, to keep a watchful eye, identify theft and potential fraud, and that they were actively investigating the incident. Does anyone know when that was written? 2005 by DHS US 13. So in 2005, there were already being sort of relatively forward-leaning documents communicating that this challenge was coming. I thought that particular example, given that they call that a university of about 100,000 students in the Northeast, might be particularly relevant in this case study. So I think something that's really incredibly important and something that I used at DHS was sort of aggregation tests, right? And I'll just get them down to 6. It's a little bit more complicated than that. But the question is, when is it worth aggregating all of this data? When does it actually make sense, right? And we've already talked about one dimension of it, which is the aggregation of data without the analytical capacity to make sense of it or the ability to act on it. Again, it's sort of an exercise in frustration, right? You've created this massive vulnerability, but you now have the ability to make sense of it or to action it. So you have to question whether it's necessary. The first is that necessity question, right? So, does Rutgers need to retain the information of every person who's ever touched them since time immemorial, right? Do they need to go back to what was once sort of filing cabinet databases of alumni and upload all that information into a massive database, right? Especially if, the cybersecurity budget is going to be pressed and crunched down, right? Unless you're not willing to sort of, continue to evolve, patch, and kind of keep that system up to date. So there's this. And then the next question is so one is necessity, right? Is it necessary? Then this question is the value of it, right? The value and the vulnerability of it. And you might think the value in only one sense, right? The value in the sense that the value of putting all this together is so incredibly important. But also what you've done is you potentially created a crown jewel, right? A crown jewel that potentially will inspire a nation state actor who will be, one of the differences between sort of at times you think about sort of lower-end actor and high-end actors, and Nate, tell me if you think this is right, it's persistence, right? The high-end actor is enormously persistent, right? Him hacking your database, this isn't one night, right? Why in between like him taking breaks for, Mountain Dews and gaming. I mean, this is a persistent, sustained operation, right? 6 months, 9 months, 12 months. He has enormous patience. And when he's inside your network, he may do nothing except continue to watch, learn, gather information, exploit all of it, and then at the appropriate time of his choosing, he will then take the next step. Right, so that's one of the concerns when you think about our industrial control systems, which I think Michael sort of touched on in his talk, and you think about it sort of from the national security perspective, right? So nation-state actors going against massive data sets in the United States, or going after potential systems that run, open valve, turn lights on, turn lights off. Their intention may actually be to penetrate, gain full control, exercise small tests that validate that they have the ability to do something, and then a potentially escalatory cycle with the United States. Lights start going off, valves start opening, and as Michael and I were talking before this, one of the things he said was, we will look back and think that large data breaches are sort of quaint while we're watching the lights turn off, and that sort of jumps into the third, which is consequences, right? So necessity, value, vulnerability, and the consequence. What are the consequences when you take all of the security clearance of the national security professionals in the United States and you put them all into a single repository, which, oh by the way, didn't actually speed up the clearance process either. Because do you know what investigators do? They download it because they're going to go out into the field with the clipboard and ask you actually questions to say, hey, where were you in college? Was your college roommate? Has that person ever been involved with an anarchist group dedicated to the violent low of the United States? Those kind of questions for the students in the audience. always best to say no, and always best to have never been, associated with an organization dedicated to the violent overthrow of the United States. It probably won't advance your positioning in government. And then that fourth test is so you have necessity, value, vulnerability, consequences. Then you sort of get into this dimension of protection, right? So if it passes all those initial tests, like how are you going to protect it, right? Do you have the resources to protect it? Does it actually make sense? The fifth is contingency plans, right? So when you get that first alert that there's a potential anomaly in your system, do you actually have the contingency plans to do that? I was just recently speaking with a colleague, and one of their contingency plans is they sever the network immediately upon any. And unfortunately, they're in a space where they can. I mean, he'll give that admonishment, right? A large bank, it's really difficult for them to sever the network, right? Severing their network is severing their relationship with all their clients around the architecture. There's brand issues, there's share issues. The CEO invariably will be calling an emergency gathering of the board, and he has to explain why X large bank just severed the network and why everything's gone dead. But it's an interesting contingency plan that they've thought through this, right? And at any signature where there's a potential penetration, they just move to sever the network. And the sixth test is sort of data retention. How long do you actually need to keep all this stuff, right? Does it actually make sense to keep it into perpetuity, right? Again, the problem is that it's much easier to store it than it is to sort of have folks go in and very manually sort of remove that data and that information from it. So there's the two sides of the fire. One's going to cook your lunch, one's going to burn your house down. And now what I thought would be interesting here, we hear a lot about hacks, and I was talking to Abba about this talk, and knowing that I had the illustrious post-lunch sort of period of time where, invariably it's been a long day already for many that have been here since the morning. But I thought would be interesting is actually have Nate come in and sort of show you actually what a hack sort of looks like, right? At sort of a rudimentary level, but it will give you a sense of what this looks like. Nate?
All right, hello. Let me exit out of this, bring up this, and then let me slide this. Oh, there we go. Okay. Let me make that. It's a little hard working off one screen and looking at another, so bear with me. Where's my mouse? Oh, there it is. Okay. So, again, my name is Nathan Cotterba. I'm VP of Product Management at a cybersecurity company called Blackpoint Cyber. And Ron asked me here today to kind of give an introduction and kind of show what a real hack looks like. Obviously, a lot of us are familiar with hacks and data breaches. We read about them in the news. Maybe we're even victim to them based on some of the companies or organizations we do business with. But it's pretty amazing when you actually start talking to people, like the technical understanding, or even really understanding the challenges of what a hack is and how long it can take. I think a lot of people don't have a lot of experience with. So we're going to go through kind of a live demo. So on the left here, as any good hacker always does, I have some slides to organize myself. And then on the right, you're going to see the hacker's terminal. And I'll try and explain what's going on as we go through. So for a hacker, a principal goal for most hackers in an organization is to hunt down basically a super user. That's a user who has permissions and credentials to basically move freely in the network, download files, access resources that they shouldn't. And in part of getting that super user is also to be able to laterally spread. As Ron mentioned, it's very rare you land exactly where you need to in an infrastructure. You often need to move to where in that environment you want to steal data. On the flip side, I'm also going to show our product, which will kind of highlight maybe a defender's view of what happens during a hack. So here we have our nice tidy hacker checklist. The very first thing we need to do is get inside the environment. So I'm sure many people are familiar with spear phishing or have heard of it, or maybe get emails from IT or security saying don't click on links or files you don't know or understand. Surprisingly, it's still very popular. So what we're going to do is we're going to pretend that we have sent an email with a spear phishing link to someone in the victim organization. And you can see right here they've accessed their webmail. They've got a request for quote PDF file attachment. And hackers have become very clever at doing targeted spear phishing. So they might actually look up that you've been to a conference like this, that you attended, that you spoke, and send you a very targeted message so that you're more likely to click or engage the malware. And especially when you send, I'll tell you, if you send quotes to like sales guys, invoice guys, marketing, those people love to click things. So no offense if anyone's in those fields, but it's all about, right, customer interaction and doing business with those kind of people. And so it's, you need to be especially aware of what you click, what you're opening, and who it's from. And hackers have also gotten really good now at sending emails that look like they come from your boss or your business partner or maybe your supplier. They can actually change the name of the sender. So if you don't pay attention, it's very easy to mistakenly click on something that you shouldn't. So unfortunately, the victim here has clicked and opened that link. And unbeknownst to them, what's happened simultaneously is a backdoor communication has been opened between their computer and our hacker server. So I'm going to, on the right there, what you'll see is we've got kind of a connection callback. And then we're actually going to, and this is the hacker's terminal, maybe he's somewhere overseas, he's going to connect to it, and once he connects to the terminal, he can run commands on it as if he was sitting right there at the desk. So he's able to run things like find information about the network, find information about the users, and this kind of gives a nice summary of kind of the current state of the hacker's perception of the infrastructure. So this was the victim, in this case it's Lisa, and Lisa clicked that, opened that PDF. What that does just by opening that file is create a network connection through her network over the internet back to the hacker's server. And the hacker, who's sitting at a terminal with a bunch of text and information, their next goal is really to try and understand this question mark. And as Ron alluded to, this is the part of the hack where hackers and hacktivists, thugs will often spend weeks, months, and even years doing. Because their goal is to really understand the infrastructure so that they can make sure, one, not to get caught by any security tools or staff, but also to understand where those big data sets are located, either to wipe them in a destruction attack or to actually steal them to then use for obviously nefarious purposes. So once the hacker lands in the environment, they have to do a lot of reconnaissance, which kind of ties nicely into Ron's background, I guess, being a force marine reconnaissance. So just like in the real world, in a military operation, hackers go through reconnaissance activities. So on the right here, and I apologize, I know it's a little low in the screen, what we're going to start doing is we have a little part of our malware that is called recon. And what that's going to do is it's going to start probing the attacked network to try and identify basically key infrastructure components as well as identify the users in that infrastructure. And so it's running various scripts to reach out and make remote connections, query the domain controller, which is kind of like the master computer in this infrastructure. And you can see it pulled back some information. So for instance, it knows we're in lab DC1. It pulls some information about the user. And it also does some very targeted port scanning. So when a network connection's made, it requires opening a port on a computer. And a lot of different services run on various ports. So hackers like to probe throughout the infrastructure to see which ports are open, where can I get into, what can I access right now. And what's interesting to take away from this is nowadays with the emergence of IoT devices, there's a lot more devices on a network and an infrastructure than a lot of people are aware of. And one way that hackers kind of identify both the network and the infrastructure on it is by doing this targeted port scanning. So this is very common tactic during a hack. So we've done some preliminary port scanning. We've got some information back. And so again, this is kind of what the hacker's doing during the enumeration phase. So the screen here is our Snap Defense platform. And it's nice because it gives a visual kind of representation of the hack and what's actually happened or occurred. So the computer that was the target, or patient 0, was Win7 behind. And that was where Lisa clicked on that spear-phished email. Then, as you remember, they did some reconnaissance. So some of the things the hacker did was they tried to remotely access this computer, which is this alert dialog you're seeing here, as well as they tried to access some file shares on this computer here. And so most tools, unfortunately, and most cybersecurity does not really look for this kind of enumeration activity, especially if it's targeted. It tends to focus much more, on malware, exploits, browser exploits. But this kind of activity can go on for weeks and months. And without kind of the capability to identify these kind of remote connections, it becomes very hard, like as Ron mentioned, to stop something before you're basically unplugging the internet because it's too late. So in the tool, you're going to see a couple of dialogues. This one, again, is talking about the particular connection to this one, this computer, which is actually a router that allows internet to go in and out of the infrastructure. And then the other alert that we'll show quickly and come up in a second is trying to mount some file shares on the domain controller, which again is that supercomputer in the infrastructure. So one of the things that when you start to see this kind of activity that cyber defenders or analysts often do is they'll need to find metadata about the attack to try and understand whether this is indeed malicious. So one of the areas where I know big data and data science is actively making inroads is trying to essentially identify patterns, just like in the battle in Iraq, with large sets of information and data to better understand what is actually a threat and what is more maybe benign or just noise that can be avoided. And so some of the information that is processed and that users look at is going to come up shortly. But essentially, it's digging into each one of these computers and trying to really understand what caused these connections to go back, to go from the patient 0 to both of these targets. So it should be coming up shortly. There we go. So I got a little ahead of the video. So what we're doing now is we're going to look at the various data that we know about this particular patient 0. And so there's various types of information you can use to kind of what we call hunt a threat or triage a threat. And that includes netstat, which is all the network connections to and from that computer. We also will look at like the processes running. So every time you launch Excel or Word or Google Chrome, it creates a process. And so what we'll do is we'll look to see, indeed, at the bottom here, again, I apologize because it's at the bottom of the screen, but is that request for quote PDF, so we can see it was running. We can go over to the netstat and we can look to see if it's made any external connections. And sure enough, right here, we can see it's made an external connection out to a particular IP address and port. And then we also can look at everything that was created prior to that alert that we got in our system. And so what you see right here in this kind of tree-like structure is all the processes that were executed. This iexplore.exe is Internet Explorer, where she was checking her webmail. And that in turn, she opened the request for PDF, and unbeknownst to her, all these other processes were launched, including PowerShell, which is built into Windows and used by a lot of attackers. That PowerShell, you can see here are some command line arguments, and I know this is kind of getting into the weeds, but this is what I get to stare at every day, so you get to live a day in the life of a cyber operator. And over here, you can see that it was actually downloading some scripts from the internet. So what's interesting about hacking and malware is it's constantly evolving. Back in the day, hackers spent a long time building a really custom tool set. Unfortunately, nowadays, similar to kind of the data information science, as soon as that tool set gets detected, it gets broadcasted throughout the world. And so it makes it very difficult to kind of build custom malware. So instead what happens is people build really lightweight malware, drop it into an environment, and then that malware kind of pulls payloads from their server to do the specific tasks they want. So kind of like on-the-fly task execution. And so that is what we saw that script was doing, was pulling down a script from the internet and launching it. So we've seen the spear phishing. We've now done some network discovery and access. This is again back on the hacker side because we did some port scanning. We saw those boxes lighting up on the other screen. We're now going to do some domain discovery. So one of the key elements of most breaches is finding a domain administrator or that super user. And what's really fascinating to me as I learned and got more involved in cybersecurity is how many of the tools that the hackers use actually are built right into like the systems themselves. So like Windows has this capability where you can literally, even without privileges, say, tell me everyone who's a domain administrator, and it'll just spit you right back all the information you need. You don't need elevated credentials. You don't need some fancy exploit. And so what we see right here is we ran that command, and it spit back all the administrators. And we can see that some of these are kind of general accounts, administrator, dev user, but there's one, F. Miller, that looks very similar to kind of L. Rich, which is the username I'm running as. And so what we're going to do now is we're actually going to hunt this user. We want to hunt them because once we find them, we can try to impersonate them and gain full access to the infrastructure. So this little hunt script here, what it's doing is it's asking the infrastructure, were there any network connections that were started by F. Miller? And we got one result back. We can see here there was a session from this IP that says F. Miller is currently logged into this box and they've made a connection, and so we're going to now try and spread our malware from patient 0 to wherever this person is logged in so we can basically hunt down the administrator. So we did the domain discovery, we found the domain admin. We're now going to spread with this spread command. We're going to enter the IP address of where that super user is logged in. We're going to essentially recopy our malware over there. And what we've done here, not to get into too much of the technical details, is again, we've used something that's built directly into the Windows operating system. So we have essentially not needed to write any custom malware. We've been able to leverage something in Windows to remotely execute our malware on yet another machine, and we've gotten down here another network callback from that particular second machine. And so we've successfully laterally spread, and this technique is very prevalent in most modern sophisticated malware. And unfortunately, there's really not much you can do because it's also part of kind of how Windows operates. And so it's kind of an inherent flaw in the system. So flipping back over to the Snap Defense platform, we now see another compromised end host, this Win8 Montana. And if we bring up the alert, we can see that lrich, which was our compromised user, remotely executed svchost.exe on the target, which is Win8 Montana. And so, as a cyber operator, one of the challenges is trying to make sense of all of these different activities. With the tool we built, we really tried to focus on making kind of the alerts and the information, although it may still seem rather technical and complicated, depending on your experience with cybersecurity, compared to a lot of the other tools or the way people have approached it. We feel like it's relatively, more human readable and more understandable, because what we really need to do is, there's a big disconnect in the ability of, there's just a shortage in cybersecurity professionals. There's a lot of IT administrators through the years. There's very few cybersecurity professionals. And so even though the schools and training centers are trying to pump them out as fast as they can, unfortunately, there's nothing like real-world experience to build qualified people. And so, we wanted to try, with our tool, we really tried to focus on the key elements of a hack, and then obviously building something that what they call a tier 1 analyst, a beginner or a junior analyst, could actually make sense of. So when we launched that remote task, you saw that there was, down here, we bring up kind of the process tree again, and it used this wmic.exe. And so again, that's that built-in Windows command that allows you to do various network and administration activities actually used in a malicious way to laterally spread the malware from our patient 0 over to our second compromised end host where that domain administrator is actively logged in. So, and I think over here it's just showing that the malware was relaunched as svchost.exe. So we're going to go now flip back over to the hacker side. So we were able to hunt the domain admin. We then were able to laterally spread. And so kind of the final task in our hack is to gain the same credentials of that administrator, that super user account. And so down here you can see we've got two connections. If you run the whoami command in Windows, it tells you your user. We can see we're still that lab lrich user. So when we spread our malware, we were able to, give me one second. So we spread our malware, we got that new connection back. We can now connect to that new machine, which was the Win8 Montana. And now what we're going to do, once it connects, is we're going to steal a token. So as part of the security mechanism of most operating systems, there's tokens associated with various running processes. And a process, again, is like Microsoft Word, PowerPoint, Excel. What you can do is Windows actually makes it fairly easy to steal tokens of running processes. So what we were looking for is we want to compromise the fmiller account. We can see here that on this machine, fmiller is running explorer.exe, which is kind of the root user interface for Windows. And the process ID is 2476. So we have a little bit of script that essentially attempts to steal that token and will relaunch a third connection back to this machine impersonating this super user. And so we've entered the command down here. And it takes a few seconds. We'll see we now have two connections to Win8 Montana. And if we connect to the one we just made and run whoami, we can see that we're lab fmiller, which is now essentially the domain administrator. So now we've got essentially full admin privileged access to this infrastructure. At this point, it's basically like game over. And what's kind of interesting, just to kind of recap, is it all kind of starts with that initial breach, that spear phishing, a network discovery, domain discovery, and then what we did is we hunted the domain admin, and then we laterally spread to where they were, stole their token, and now we have full access to the infrastructure. This is what's happened in pretty much every hack you've read about. Target, Home Depot, Sony, the Ukraine power grid. And what's kind of interesting is even though these types of hacks continue to happen, companies and organizations still seem kind of uneducated in exactly what happens and why. And so I appreciate Ron for kind of letting me come here today, kind of explaining this. I know it's quite technical. It's also a lot to cover in like 15 to 20 minutes. But if you have any questions about this, I can obviously go into more detail. I do think that down the road, even though big data can be a challenge, as Ron mentioned, in terms of aggregating a lot of information that now puts all your eggs into one basket, I also see applications for big data kind of helping to try and detect threats and reduce the amount of noise and false alarms in cybersecurity. So that is some of the kind of technology that my company is also looking at leveraging in our platform. So thank you.
Don't go away.
Oh, okay.
Okay, Abbas afforded us a few more minutes if there's any questions. If not, we'll wrap up and roll to the next speaker. Yes, please.
How long does a hack like that take?
Yeah, great question. So usually I would say a hack like this, we've obviously sped it up, would be between like 3 to 6 months. That's not to say they couldn't. I mean, if you got lucky